Some instructors let the students know that this is their first time teaching online, and they might even tell them they are a little anxious. I would never admit that to my students. Oh, well, welcome to Module 5, Lecture 12, and this lecture covers a trio of articles from the Minkston-Snyder reader that focus on war, diplomacy, and decision-making. And so what I'm going to do is go through each of the three articles and highlight some of the most salient points that are important for you to remember. So the first article is written by Karl von Clausewitz, and it's on war and policy. And for, among other things, he's famous for having written this phrase: "War is nothing but a continuation of political intercourse with a mixture of other means." So what does this mean in practice? War can never fully be separated from political intercourse. And at the same time, it is true the political element does not sink deep into the details of war. So the question is that whether in planning for war, politics should be less important than military strategy. He asks this rhetorically, but it's an important question to understand if we want to know how do the dynamics of politics intersect with the sort of politics of war, and should those two things be separate, and should the military strategists focus on the military objectives and let politics kind of exist outside of that realm? So what's interesting is he highlights the fact that actual changes in the art of war are a consequence of alterations in policy. So in that sense, politics does have an effect on the conduct of war because it establishes the rules under which it can be conducted. So in a kind of tautological sense, he says that the conduct of war is therefore policy itself. So what you do in the course of warfare may then influence what decision makers in political positions may decide is important to distinguish for future engagements. And so by, say, doing something on the battlefield, it may influence politics, which then helps to structure the rules of future warfare. The second article is by Thomas Schelling, and it's on diplomacy and violence. And he says diplomacy is bargaining. It seeks outcomes that, though not ideal for either party, are better for both than some of the alternatives. So this is the idea that war may not be so separable from politics, but it can be overcome if we go to pursue diplomacy as opposed to conflict. But at the same time, it's not that easy to accept a diplomatic alternative because certain aspects of a situation need to be in place in order for that to be even possible. One is that it must be in the common interest of both or all parties relevant. If one party has no intentions at all of engaging diplomatically with the other states, then there's simply no hope for a diplomatic solution. An awareness of need to make the other party prefer one's own preferred outcome. So this means that the parties that are working together collaboratively in this diplomatic arena need to kind of jockey for position with one another so that they can convince the other side that what is ultimately the best course of action is what is the preferred course of action for that state. So if you were talking to a friend and you had a dispute over where you wanted to go for dinner, right? Well, one thing is maybe you're really interested in having Italian food and your friend is really interested in having Mexican food. But you have to kind of sell your argument, even though you're going to discuss this in a peaceable fashion, in such a way that you can still get what you want by suggesting that your way, inadvertently, may be in the best interest of the friend of yours. So, for example, a way that you could go about doing that is to say that, well, you know, if we go to a Mexican restaurant on Taco Tuesday, then that way we'll spend less money. And today is Monday night, so we're not going to have the same kinds of deals. So maybe tonight we go for Italian food and maybe tomorrow we go for Mexican food, because that way you can kind of suggest to them that they should do what you want to do. So in diplomacy, that's part of the art of diplomatic dialogue, is to convince the other party that they should do what you want to do. Military force allows a country to forcibly achieve goals, but it also hurts and destroys. So unlike diplomacy, violence has these other kinds of bleed over effects, which could have long-standing consequences, which might impact your ability to work through problems in the future. So the power to hurt is bargaining power. To exploit it is diplomacy. So this is an acknowledgement of the fact that diplomacy can be utilized in such a way that it obviates the need to hurt directly through these kind of violent channels, and that instead you can still exploit those same kinds of conditions, but do so in a way that avoids the violent confrontation. There's a difference between taking what you want, which is brute force, and making someone give it to you, which is coercion. So in the view of Thomas Schelling, war no longer looks like just a contest of strength. Now, moving to the third and final article that we've been looking at for this lecture, Robert Jervis, whose work actually informed some of what we discussed when we talked about different cognitive biases and decision-making processes and rational action and that kind of thing in the context of foreign policy decision-making. So this article talks about what's known as game theory. So Robert Jervis talks about anarchy, a concept that we are now very familiar with, and he says anarchy encourages behavior that leaves all concerned worse off than they could be. So this suggests that there needs to be some kind of mechanism, whether it's an institution or some kind of decision-making intervention that combats the impacts of anarchy on the international system. He recognizes that in terms of cooperation, there are incentives to defect from one another. So countries have reasons to not want to cooperate. And at the same time, the desire to preserve the status quo. Maybe two countries are in a very peaceable relationship, maybe they're in an alliance, or they just haven't had any kind of negative relations. That desire can change over time due to new circumstances. And so that may shift our calculations about the appropriate course of action that we need to take when confronted with new decisions, new crises, and that kind of thing. So in order to protect possessions, states seek to control foreign resources. And acknowledging this, it helps us to understand some of the motivating factors that may lead states to more aggressive tendencies, and to then, based on that assumption, predict what they're likely to do under certain circumstances. And finally, Jervis points out the fact that the means by which states increase their security decrease the security of other states. And we know from having learned about this before that this is known as the security dilemma. So if you look at the graphic that's on the bottom, these are a couple different games within what's known as game theory, which uses economic ideas about behavior to understand likely outcomes and decisions that people or states even might make. So we have two different games here. We have Stag Hunt and Prisoner's Dilemma. And you can see that these numbers are arrayed within these boxes, and they're what's known as a payoff matrix. And so what you can see is that each of those numbers corresponds to the payoff that an individual will experience based on whether they decide to cooperate or defect. And so based on those numbers, we can get a sense of what is the optimal decision. So if you look over at the prisoner's dilemma, which is discussed in the textbook by Goldstein and Peevehouse, you can see that there are different kinds of payoffs for different actors depending on whether they cooperate or defect. So in the prisoner's dilemma scenario, because there's imperfect information, because the prisoners aren't able to communicate with one another, then they wind up doing what they think is in their own best interest, which is to rat out the other prisoner, so they both defect. Now, if they're doing that and the other one does not defect, then there's a completely different payout. But because they don't trust each other, because there's these information issues, they both wind up defecting, and had they cooperated, they actually would have been in a better position because 2 is lower number than 3. So here in this particular payoff matrix, 1 is better than 2, is better than 3, is better than 4. So had the prisoners have been able to communicate, they might have said, look, if we both just cooperate, then we can actually have a better outcome in terms of a lesser sentence than if we both decide to go at it on our own. But both of them think in terms of the cooperation and defection boxes, right? So that they think that they will defect and the other person will cooperate. And so they're likely to have the best outcome and the other one is likely to have the worst outcome, when in fact, because they both defected, they wind up in a situation where the payoff, in their case, the prison sentence, is longer than it would have been if they just cooperated. So this is kind of a way of wrapping our heads around, when you have a couple of different actors involved, what are the likely outcomes of their decisions based on whether they cooperate or defect with the other party, and how our payoffs are affected by the decisions of others. So let's look at kind of a concrete example of where you've got, we're going to kind of oversimplify here for a moment, but two different parties, lots of imperfect information, but also at the same time lots of history, which makes it different than a one-time game. This is a repeated game if we're using the language of game theory. And we're going to look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so the question that is motivating our analysis here is, why did it begin and why does it continue? Because it seems like it's something that has no end in sight, and yet analysts have for a long time proposed many different kinds of solutions that have been alternatively dismissed and taken up without any kind of real serious intention to implement. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, what we're going to do is watch a short video that kind of talks about the history and some of the dynamics of the conflict. And then we're going to stop for a moment and just ask ourselves some questions, given what we've read from these three chapters, about how we can better understand this conflict, and maybe from that understanding generate some ideas about how to potentially solve it. So let's take a moment and watch that video, and then we'll come back to some really important questions that utilize the articles we've just read.
Of Israel and Palestine. Through the centuries, the land we now call Israel and Palestine changed hands many times as different groups of people battled for control of the area. Over time, the establishment of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions made the land, especially the city of Jerusalem, a uniquely holy place. For about 1,000 years in the Middle Ages, the Arabs almost always held control of the area, and actually lived relatively peacefully with the Jews. In fact, it was the Christians, during their brief rule, who massacred and persecuted both the Jews and Muslims. At the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, the idea of statehood had firmly taken root around the world, and so, naturally, many Jews wanted a country of their own. But in the 2,000 years since the founding of Judaism, most Jews had left the Promised Land and spread throughout the world. But with the goal of creating their own country now achievable, large numbers of Jews started to come back and settle in Palestine. World War I brought the defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the hands of the British, French, and Russians, giving them control of the Middle East. They divided it up, and the British were given a mandate over Palestine. With the more sympathetic British now in control, these Jewish Zionists, as they were called, seized the opportunity to accelerate their plan for statehood. But creating a state for the Jews wasn't really the goal of the British, who just wanted to create a government in Palestine where power could be shared peacefully by the different groups living there. And then there were the Arabs, who didn't trust the British or the Jews because many of the Arab leaders thought the British would favor the Jews. So the Arabs refused to form any government that included Jewish participation. But before long, this stubbornness grew into frustration at not being represented. So some within the Arab community turned to violence and carried out bombing attacks against Jewish settlers and started to destroy the crops the settlers were growing on their farms. About a decade later, World War II broke out, and millions of Jews were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. After the American, British, and Allied forces defeated the Germans, hundreds of thousands of Jews came to Palestine, and the UN General Assembly passed a fateful plan to divide up Palestine into independent Arab and Jewish states, with the all-important city of Jerusalem placed under international control. But the 5 members of the Arab League didn't want the Jews to control any part of the land, so they all voted against the plan. In May 1948, after much planning and covert arms acquisition, the Jewish leadership went ahead and declared the establishment of the State of Israel, and quickly convinced the US government, the Soviet Union, and many other countries to officially recognize it. As expected by the Israelis, the Arab countries invaded Palestine immediately, but the Israelis were ready and were more disciplined, better trained, and well armed, and were too strong for their Arab enemies. When the dust settled, after 10 months of fighting and peace agreements were signed, Israel not only kept the whole area under the original UN plan, it controlled almost 60% of the land that had been planned for the Arab state. More than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs had also fled the fighting or were kicked out of their homes, and about the same amount of Jews migrated into Israel from Arab lands. So you had about 1.5 million people basically switching places, making the population of Israel much more Jewish. A generation later, in 1967, tensions were again reaching a boiling point. There had been some deadly cross-border attacks from both the Israelis and the Arabs, so Israel decided to launch a surprise invasion, and in 6 days won control of the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, took the West Bank and East Jerusalem away from Jordan, and kicked Syria out of the Golan Heights. Fewer than 1,000 Israeli troops were killed in the short war, but over 20,000 Arab soldiers died, went missing, or were captured. And just like in the 1948 war, hundreds of thousands more Palestinian Arabs left. Since then, Israel's really built up its security capabilities and constructed many settlements in these newly occupied territories, even though the UN and the International Court of Justice declared the settlements illegal under international law. 10 years after the war, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and in 2005 pulled its troops and the settlers out of the Gaza Strip. But there are around 750,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. In 1993, Israel struck a deal with the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, and agreed to allow the Palestinians to set up a government and rule themselves in the Gaza Strip and the city of Jericho in the West Bank. In exchange, the PLO recognized the right of Israel to exist. This new Palestinian government, headed by Arafat, became known as the Palestinian Authority and was controlled by its majority party, Fatah. But not all Palestinians, especially people in the Gaza Strip, liked Arafat's more moderate approach, and so a split took place, leading to the rise of the more extremist Islamic party, Hamas, whose leaders refused to negotiate with Israel or recognize its right to exist. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian parliamentary election, but Fatah refused to be a minority party, and a violent power struggle between Hamas and Fatah played out in the streets of Gaza. After more than 100 people died in the fighting, Hamas controlled the area. So Arafat's successor, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, essentially cut the Gaza Strip loose from the Palestinian Authority and set up an emergency, Fatah-controlled government in the West Bank. So today, there are two fairly different Palestines. One is the West Bank, led by Abbas and his Fatah party, who more or less coexist peacefully with their many Jewish neighbors, although Israel is in the process of building a 400-mile-long barrier along the border. It's Abbas who's engaged in ongoing negotiations with Israel and the international community about reaching a solution to the conflict that would allow Palestine to become an independent country. The other Palestine is the Gaza Strip, which is essentially poor and mostly cut off from the rest of the world by Israel's sea embargo and a wall that divides it from Israel and Egypt, leaving its people without many basic necessities, including clean drinking water. Gaza is very dependent on the UN and the rest of the international community for aid. It's controlled by Hamas. Khaled Mashal is the chairman of Hamas and has led the party since the 2004 assassination of the Hamas leader al-Rantisi. Mashal, though, lives in Qatar. In 1997, Israel tried, but failed, to assassinate him in retaliation for the bombing of a market in Jerusalem that Hamas claimed responsibility for. It's Hamas who has been the target of repeated Israeli military actions recently, including this year's Operation Protective Edge, which was a response to a number of attacks by Hamas against Israelis, including kidnappings and rocket attacks, both of which have been aided by the digging of many tunnels under both the Gaza-Israeli border and Gaza's southern border with Egypt. Hamas uses these tunnels to smuggle in weapons and money that it gets from others in the region who have an interest in destabilizing Israel's security, like Iran. In its response to Hamas, Israel has taken heavy criticism for its destructive and vengeful airstrikes that kill a high number of civilians. There are generally two ideas for how to end the conflict and give Palestinian statehood. The first is a two-state solution, where Israel and Palestine would be two sovereign countries living side by side. This is the strategy embraced by many in the international community, including US President Barack Obama, and is embraced by people like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party. But time after time, negotiations around this solution fail because of the many issues it has to confront and resolve, like what to do about the 750,000 Jewish settlers in Palestinian areas, the instability of the Gaza Strip, the fact that the Gaza Strip and the West Bank aren't even connected, and of course, who would control Jerusalem? These obstacles have given rise to a second, alternative solution that's embraced by many Arab Israelis and even Jewish politicians like the newly elected president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin. They think the only practical way to go is a one-state solution compromise, where neither the Palestinians nor the Jewish people get exactly what they want, but would instead be unified in one single state that would ensure equal rights for all of its citizens. Proponents of this plan think it would solve one of the world's toughest problems and remove the entire area from the criticism of the modern world. The main argument from Israelis against the one-state solution is that it would instantly end the idea of a Jewish state and would make Jews a minority again. But looking at the numbers, on a combined Arab-Israeli state, Jews would number 6.6 million and Arabs around 5.6 million. Of course, that's before the issue of people migrating back to this unified country is settled. Another issue that would require a creative solution is the wealth gap between the technologically driven and very prosperous economy of Israel and the much more challenged economic situation of the Palestinian territories. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this video helps you see the situation with clearer eyes the next time it's in the news. But I want to know what you think. How should the Israeli-Palestinian conflict be solved?
Okay, so now that we watched the film, let's take a look at some of the questions that relate to the articles that we've covered in this lecture. So, would you agree with von Clausewitz that the conflict here is nothing but a continuation of political intercourse? Or is it the case that there are other factors at play, like religious and historical issues, which are not likely to be resolved by any kind of political solution? How does the way in which the two sides engage in conflict shape the way in which the conflict is conducted? We saw that there's this kind of back and forth between Hamas and the Israeli military, or the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, and there seems to be this spiral of events in which there's some act that's engaged by one of the sides and it gets retaliated by the other side, and this further legitimizes the actions taken by either the Palestinians or the Israelis because they feel that they are being threatened, either because they are being mistreated and their human rights are being violated, or because they feel like they are under constant threat from terrorists, if you're in the case of Israel. What are the objectives for each side, and are there alternatives to conflict? Is it the case that we saw two different alternative strategies or solutions, right? One was a two-state solution where you have Israel and then you've got the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as sort of separate entities but constituting one state. Is that the goal that the Palestinians have, to retain control of those two territories, maybe to unify them under one government? Or is it the case that perhaps they want to see returning some of the land that they had previously lost in 1948, and that they're not going to be fully satisfied until they have acquired that land? The other alternative, of course, was this one unified state solution, where, as you saw, numerically speaking, there were roughly 6 million Jews and roughly 5.5 million or so Arabs. The issue is for Israelis that this, as we saw from the video, the state of Israel was set up to be a home for Jewish people, and so if it's significantly watered down by the influx of non-Jewish Arabs, what does that say about the existence of the state itself, or at least its initial conception? And then in the future, one of the issues is that because of population and demographic trends, you have the likelihood that people who are coming in from other areas, or people who live in the poorer areas like the Gaza Strip, may have a greater population rate, which means that in some manner of years, the number of Arabs will actually overtake the number of Jewish people. And then at that point, by default, Israel will cease to be a Jewish state, and that may be upsetting to a lot of people. So are these two solutions, do they meet the expectations or the objectives of each side? Why have we seen a stalemate emerge? And why have we seen conflict continue as a result of, in spite of perhaps the discussions that are seemingly endless? One question that I don't know if we have enough evidence to suggest a real definitive answer for is, how has each side tried to convince the other to prefer a particular outcome? It seems like the way in which that has been meted out in reality is, if you're talking about the Palestinians or in particular Hamas, it has been that to suggest that the Israelis don't want to suffer violence and a constant threat of terrorist activities, so they should yield to the demands of Hamas. On the other hand, you have the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli government who are saying, look, if you attack us, we will attack you with much more force that we're bringing to bear on your situation. So you will always be at a disadvantage to us. You're never going to win this battle. So does that suggest to the Palestinians that it is a fight not worth fighting or continuing? Is it suggestive enough so that they lay down their arms? So far, we've seen that the answer is no, and both sides continue apace, and there doesn't seem to be a real clear end in sight. In addition, the actions of the Israeli government to erect these settlements or to continue to build upon existing settlements clearly draws the ire of the Palestinians and flouts international law, and so that creates a lot of concerns about whether Israel's approach is to be just intransigent and try to continue developing or encroaching upon that land so that they force out the Palestinians or put them onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. So at least for this particular question, we haven't seen a great deal of effort to convince the other side that the other actors' preferences are maybe better than their own or would lead to a better outcome, because it's been more about kind of compelling the other actor by virtue of violence or encroaching upon territory and continuing to violate international law. And neither of those have proven to be very successful thus far at addressing the conflict. What are the incentives to defect from cooperation? So why would someone not want this to end? If you are a Palestinian politician, there may be reasons relating to electoral motives that you can look at. For the state of Israel, the same kinds of issues apply. You could have people who want to take a very firm stance, and in fact, the Netanyahu government certainly has taken a very hardline stance on the Palestinian question. So instead of cooperating, we see kind of a retreat, at least in the past several years, from any kind of real concerted effort to cooperate. And it seems like the incentives are to placate the constituents by maintaining a very hardline stance, as opposed to perhaps giving something up, right? And so those are the kinds of incentives that emerge to preserve the status quo. It's kind of like here in the United States, you never want to be soft on crime, right? You wouldn't want to fire police officers. You wouldn't want to eviscerate the budget for the firefighters. So how can you make a strong presence? How can you continue to show your constituents that you are representing their interests? Well, if one of the biggest issues is this Palestinian issue, then taking a very hardline stance seems to be something that a lot of people still tend to favor, although there are younger generations of Israelis, both Arab and non-Arab, who see this as something that has been going on their entire lives, and they're upset with it, and they don't want it to continue forever. And so there may be in the future, with new leadership, new ideas about how they can address the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians without leading to further bloodshed.